So we're going to push right along into our technical session before our break, which is the groundwater group. So if the speakers for this session, Thomas, Helen, Meredith, and Simone, could please move to these seats while our moderator, Scott Bradford, introduces it, that would be great.
Hello, my name's Scott Bradford, and I'm the research leader of a USDA ARS unit here on campus that focuses on sustainable agricultural water systems, and I've been asked to moderate this session. And we have a very strong groundwater group here with this proposal team, and it's been a pleasure to work with them. And you've heard talks earlier in the day discussing the importance of groundwater, and I really don't need to address that again. But I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Thomas Harter, and he'll be focusing on groundwater modeling. Our next speaker will be Helen Dahlke, and she'll be discussing groundwater recharge. Then our third speaker is Meredith Goebel, who is at Stanford, and she'll be talking about hydrogeophysics. And our final speaker is Simone Williams, who will be talking about the impacts of land management on groundwater and how to model those. So with that, we'll turn over the time to Thomas.
Good morning, everyone, and I appreciate Felicia sort of giving me the cue in for our whole group's presentation here this morning, which is providing the, part of our work will be to provide some clarity and some vision of that murkiness that we often experience when we talk about groundwater. The groundwater group's purpose is to help understand what happens when we operate in the agricultural landscape to both water supply and water quality. So that first question mark there in the landscape is the question around, at that landscape level, what happens with water demand, what happens with water recharge, groundwater recharge, and what happens to groundwater quality. And then the second question that comes after that, once we understand how that landscape acts on groundwater, then the second question is, what does that do to groundwater, and when does it do something to groundwater? And that time question is particularly important with respect to groundwater contamination, which you probably have all heard how long it can take for groundwater contamination to materialize in the first place, but then also to be cleaned up as we move forward. So in my group, we have created a toolbox, and this is partially supported by this project, that provides some clarity. And what you're looking at here with a lot of clarity is the water table in the Central Valley, and the water table distribution across that Central Valley, and an inside look into that Central Valley aquifer system with about 20,000 large pumping wells supplying irrigation water and public supplied drinking water that we've created at a very high resolution so we can track some of that pollution that happens from agriculture, and we're specifically looking at nitrate, and we're going to start to look at salinity as well. And what we do is we track that water from the landscape as it spaghettis its way to domestic wells, to public water supply wells, and to irrigation wells, and we also track the age of that water. Now that is quite a formidable job to do on 10 million acres over hundreds of years to really understand the full impact. And what we have tried to do over the last few years, and where we're tying in with this project, is to create a tool where you're not going to need a program developer to come up with asking the question, so how does agriculture ultimately then impact with its new practices what happens to water quality at a particular well or in a particular district? What we've tried to create is, and I'll be happy to explain more in a poster session or give you a personal demo in a poster session tonight, an online tool where you can sit down and you can select a few things, like you can select whether you want your model to be based on which of the groundwater information systems we already have in the valley, and there's a couple of those, which one you want them based on. You can select some of these parameters. You can select a time frame that you're interested in. And then you can go in there and I say, I'm interested in the Sacramento Valley, or I'm interested in the Fresno County and Madera County and Merced County, and I want to just look at those. Or I'm interested in this particular township, or I'm interested in these Bulletin 118 groundwater basins and look just at those. And then furthermore, I'm actually interested in only wells that are at a shallow depth, or only wells that are at a deep depth, or that have a certain screen length. And so I can select wells that I'm interested in, and then I can put in my management practices. And this is where you all come in and have to help us translate what you're doing with respect to salt quality, with respect to water management, with respect to nutrient management. Help us translate that into how much less loading occurs. Because what you can do on our tool is you can pick any crop in that region that you're interested in and say, okay, I can reduce that crop over the next X years, the loading by 10%, by 20%, by 40%. You can move the slider, and we'll do this for the whole Central Valley here quickly. You move the slider for, say, all crops and say, I'm going to 50% of baseline loading. You punch a button, you wait a few seconds, and after 10 seconds, we've calculated 400 years, 20,000 wells, breakthrough curves on that new loading. And it will then tell you what that looks like relative to baseline. We can look at a number of different statistics and compare what would happen under baseline conditions, meaning business as usual conditions, and how reducing that loading, how that now improves water quality over the next 10, 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 years. We provide some basic statistics that you can look at across the board, and that is for water quality in those wells that you've selected in your particular region. So that's the tool that we're super excited about, because this tool is what helps us connect what we're all doing in this project to what we can predict about how that improves, hopefully, groundwater quality over the next 50, 100, or 200 years. Thank you.
Do I just go forward? Okay, perfect.
You have to go forward quite a few because I have some.
Oh, wow. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me today. So I wasn't here this morning, so I cannot quite connect to what was said in the morning, but the last speaker, Stephanie, was talking about groundwater recharge being a big component of potentially bringing water budgets into balance. And so my group spends a lot of time, particularly a lot of time in the field, on evaluating the impact of groundwater recharge on not just water quantity, but more and more so on groundwater quality. And this connects to the previous talk. We need to know if we now add in certain parts of the landscape, we add lots of water on the landscape, how is adding that water influencing potential contaminant transport to groundwater? That might it have a positive effect on groundwater quality, or do we need to be concerned about certain contaminants? In year one, we spent a lot of time on doing one big field experiment, and this was a joint effort by Thomas Harter's lab, Isaiah Kiseka's lab, Rosemary Knight's lab. We'll probably see some data from Meredith, and Dr. Bradford's group, the SAS unit. And we basically used a fallow almond orchard that just had been knocked over, where the trees had been knocked over. This is a site located about 5 miles west of Modesto, where Thomas has had a long-term project, 20 groundwater monitoring wells to monitor, for example, contamination of groundwater with nitrate. And here we picked 3 wells, which you can see here, wells 6, 7, and 8 on the left side of this picture aerial photograph here on the right. We put small ponded basins upstream in the upstream flow direction of the wells. and put several sensors into that area and then started flooding these small ponded areas, which are about 8,000 square feet in size, for 4 weeks with water, surface water, to study, again, particularly contaminant transport from the soil to the groundwater table. This is the first time where we actually had the connection between the land surface, and we could monitor when do contaminants arrive in the groundwater well, because the groundwater wells are only 5 meters away from the recharge area. And so just to show you a couple pictures, we had about 10 people involved in this measurement campaign. You can see here, each plot was equipped with 2 sensor profiles. We measured, for example, gas fluxes, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide with flux chambers. Over here, we've measured soil moisture, electric conductivity, oxygen, the gaseous or air phase in the soil, redox potential at 20, 60, 100 centimeters, 300, and 500 centimeters below soil, below land surface. We also measured ponding level and applied water, and then took over 800 samples to measure, for example, nitrate, ammonium, salts, etc. And here's some of the preliminary results. 2 of the 3 wells we equipped with sensors showed a clear breakthrough in salt. That's the middle graph on the right side, electric conductivity. 1 well didn't really show a response, and we have to figure out why that is. Where did the water go? On the left side, you see the nice breakthrough of the nice breakthrough curves of electric conductivity at the 5 center depth in the unsaturated zone. Arrival was fairly quick overall of that slightly saltier water that came from the unsaturated zone to the well. Took about 3 to 4 days. Not surprising, the water table was only about 6 meters deep, so fairly short travel time. But we are in the process of analyzing over 800 samples for multiple constituents. So this will be a very detailed, high-resolution data set that we will be digging into in more detail. And we've also collected geophysical data, totem data that we will hopefully have a chance to analyze and bring in to better inform how that data, which is currently collected statewide, could be used to better inform questions around groundwater flow and transport. Thank you very much.
Great. Hi, my name is Meredith, and I'm going to be talking about the work that our group has done at Stanford using that TTEM data, the totem data that Helen mentioned, to improve site characterization at this same study site that Helen was talking about. And the motivation for doing this is that when you're trying to model flow through the subsurface, you need some sort of model of the sediment texture. So you need to understand where the materials that are going to allow water to flow easily, like your sands and gravels, where those are located, as opposed to the fine-grained materials, which will act as barriers to flow. And understanding this would help answer questions like Helen had about why was recharged water showing up at some wells and not at others. Now, the kind of traditional approach to doing this is using measurements made in wells, so you can get sediment type information at individual wells, and then use those to build a model. So here's an example of a model at the site here, and this was created using some statistical modeling to interpolate between those well measurements. But the challenge with that is that the subsurface is really heterogeneous, and you can have a lot of variability in the subsurface sediments between those wells. And that's why we come in with geophysical imaging methods, because with geophysics, we can help fill the gaps between your well data and give a more continuous picture of what's happening in the subsurface between your wells. And this is the specific system we've used. It's called the TTEM, or the Towed Electromagnetic System. It's just a transmitter which is being used to send a signal down into the earth, and then we measure the response of the earth to that signal using a receiver, and it's all towed behind an ATV. And what this system gives us is a measure of the electrical resistivity of the subsurface. And we can use these data to build models of the subsurface that show us how the electrical resistivity varies with space. And resistivity is a great property to measure in these hydrogeologic problems because it's really sensitive to water content, water quality, and lithology, or your sediment type, specifically the amount of clay you have in the subsurface. So Javi went out in the field and collected data all over the same site Helen was talking about. So here, the black lines are where we have our models of electrical resistivity, and skipping through all of his hard work to get to this image here. This is showing the spatially varying electrical resistivity in the subsurface down to about 55 meters below the surface. And in red, we've got high resistivities, which we associate with our coarse grain materials. And in the blues and greens, we have low resistivity materials, which we associate with our fine grain materials. And we can see that there's a lot of variability at the site, especially as you start looking down with depth. It looks like we've kind of got this continuous greenish looking layer down at depth, which might be an important barrier to flow. So the next step in this workflow is to transform from this model of resistivity, which is what we get from our data set, into a model of sediment type or coarse fraction, which is actually what we want when we start building groundwater models or analyzing where we might have connected flow paths. And so we implemented a workflow that our group has been developing over the past couple of years throughout the Central Valley to do this by combining these resistivity measurements with all of those well data that we have at the site as well. And skipping entirely through all the details of that workflow, here's the result of this transform. So we can see at the surface, we've got a lot of coarse grain material in red, and then as you look down at depth, we have a bunch more fine grain material. We have a kind of thick, continuous layer of fine grain material where we do have some pathways connected through that, but not very many. And so this is really hopefully going to be useful to inform the work that Helen and Thomas are doing to understand where the water is moving in the subsurface once you start applying it at the surface for recharge. And for more, see Javi's poster this afternoon.
Hello, everyone. I'm Simone Williams, and I represent the group from University of Arizona that includes Doctors Sharon McDowell and the banker Sanyal. And today I'll be talking about our work on modeling the impacts of land management on groundwater in the Pinal Active Management Area. The Pinal Active Management Area is one of the designated groundwater management areas under the Groundwater Management Act. It's about 4,000 square miles, and it has a stated goal of balancing groundwater withdrawals with recharge. Some of the water management issues that we're experiencing is that there is limited water availability, and there is increasing groundwater mining with high rates of water level decline. The area, as shown in the map, has a significant groundwater-dependent footprint, and changing land use activities are having implications for both groundwater quality and quantity. However, management efforts tend to focus on the quantity side and less so on quality, but there are known issues with nitrate and salinity contamination of groundwater in the basin. So our objective is to examine the response of hydrological processes and groundwater quality to land management practices in the basin. And we're using a process-based, semi-distributed hydrological model to try to understand what's happening in the basin. The model is the Soil and Water Assessment Tool developed by the USDA ARS, and it subdivides the basin into subbasins and then hydrological response units based on similar soil land use and topography. And then it applies a water balance approach to estimate different components of the hydrological cycle. And in particular, it simulates the movement of water through the hydrological cycle and allows us to estimate chemical loadings and examine issues of climate impacts as well as land management practices on the watershed. There are two phases to implement in the model. There is the initial setup phase that we execute in a interface with ArcGIS and a calibration and validation phase that applies an algorithm to simulate the different components. We're currently in that phase now. And what we're observing from our preliminary data is that there are some significant trends in land management. In particular, there are 5 major crops that account for over 98% of agricultural croplands in the basin. And fallow or idle agricultural lands is a significant is a significant component of agricultural lands. And we're also observing increasing conversion of lands to high-density developments. And of course, all of this is occurring in the context of climate change and variability. And we're seeing impacts, for example, the cuts that growers have to deal with in terms of cuts with cap water available to the basin. So we're looking in the future to examine some of these land management practices, particularly in relation to the cropping pattern changes. For example, the timing of planting, irrigation and fertilization rates, and the best management practices that growers are encouraged to adapt to try to address some of these issues, and to model how the evapotranspiration and other components of the hydrologic cycle and chemical loadings are responding to these management practices. And when done, we will provide estimates of salinity, nutrients to other members of the groundwater management group for development of a decision support system, and hopefully we'll have a better understanding of what's happening in the basin so that we can inform actions to address land management practices and mitigating impacts on groundwater. I'll hand over to Scott.
So we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, if anyone has one from the audience.
The models you use, Dr. Harter, do you consider the preferential flow in that models to predict future what happens in the contamination of groundwater? And also, what percentage of contamination do you think is due to the bypass flow or preferential flow?
That is a great question. We actually, in the user interface, we allow the user to select essentially what the effective water content is in the unsaturated zone. And so you could simulate preferential flow, or you can simulate plug flow as a user and even compare then the results in terms of the timing. We have not yet implemented, but plan on implementing denitrification based on our current knowledge of denitrification distribution in the Central Valley. I think that, does that address your question? Was there one more? Yes. The percentage of contamination that happens through preferential flow. That is actually, to me, an outstanding research question. We have relatively deep unsaturated zones, especially south of here, going into the San Joaquin Valley and in the Tulare Lake Basin part of the Central Valley, and the same applies to to Pinal County in Arizona. And we have very limited understanding to about the degree to which nitrate, or salts for that matter, go through bypass flow to 100 feet or 150 or 200 feet deep water table, and how much of it is what we would call matrix flow through that depth. Some of the field work that we've done in the past indicates that it appears there is some bypass flow. It's not by macro tunnels because the roots don't go that deep, but it could be by exclusion through hydrophobic zones or partially hydrophobic zones that are in the structure of the soil, and you've seen more than one picture of how heterogeneous the soil is, and I think that will create some of these, what we would call fingered flows through the unsaturated zone, which would then create these preferential flow paths.
We don't have time for other questions right now, but I encourage you to contact the speakers during the break.